Hey everyone, I never thought I'd be the guy posting here, but life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect it. I've been married to my wife Jessica for 8 years. We met in college. Classic story. She was the outgoing, fun-loving girl everyone wanted to be around, and I was the quiet, nerdy guy who somehow managed to win her over. Life was good for a long time. We bought a house in the suburbs, got a dog named Max, and everything seemed perfect on the outside. But about 6 months ago, things started to change. At first, it was little stuff. Jessica became more secretive with her phone, she'd spend more time out with her friends, and she seemed distant, even when we were together. I chalked it up to stress at work or maybe just a rough patch in our marriage. We all go through those, right? Then she started picking fights over the smallest things. I couldn't do anything right in her eyes. I'd leave a dish in the sink and she'd blow up. I'd ask her about her day and she'd snap at me like I was interrogating her. It was like I was living with a stranger. My gut told me something was off, but I didn't want to believe it. I loved her. I still do. And the idea that something could be seriously wrong between us scared the hell out of me. That's when I started noticing the late-night texts. She'd laugh at something on her phone and quickly hide it when I walked into the room. When I asked who she was texting, she'd get defensive and say it was just a friend from work, but she'd never let me see the messages. My paranoia grew, but I tried to push it down, telling myself I was overthinking it. Looking back now, I feel like an idiot for not seeing the signs sooner. I guess part of me just didn't want to admit that our perfect life might be falling apart. So here's where things started unraveling. About a month ago, Jessica told me she was going out for a girls' night with her friend Emily. Nothing unusual there. She's always had a tight-knit group of friends, and I never minded her having a night out. But this time something felt different. She was way too eager to get out of the house, and when she left, I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't being honest with me. I tried to distract myself by watching TV, but my mind kept drifting back to Jessica. Around 11 p.m., I decided to call her just to check in. No answer. I texted her. Nothing. I told myself she was probably just having fun and didn't hear her phone, but I couldn't let it go. A couple of hours later, I still hadn't heard from her. That's when I got the idea to check her location on the Find My app. We'd shared our locations with each other for years, mainly as a safety thing when one of us was traveling. I hadn't checked it in months, but something compelled me to do it that night. When I pulled up her location, my heart sank. She wasn't at Emily's house or any bar downtown like she'd said she would be. She was in a residential neighborhood on the other side of town, a place I didn't recognize. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. Maybe she was just dropping someone off, but at 1 a.m. It didn't make sense. I tried calling her again, still no answer. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my keys and headed out the door. I had to know what was going on. When I arrived at the location, I saw her car parked outside a small, nondescript house. The lights were on and I could see shadows moving inside through the blinds. I sat in my car, watching, waiting. Every possible scenario played through my mind, each one worse than the last. And then, as if to confirm my worst fears, I saw Jessica walk out the front door with some guy I didn't recognize. They were laughing, and she was all over him in a way she hadn't been with me in months. My stomach dropped, and I felt like I was going to be sick. There it was, the truth I'd been avoiding, right in front of my eyes. I don't know what came over me, but before I knew it, I was out of the car and walking towards them. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. Jessica didn't notice me at first. She was too busy clinging to this guy, laughing at something he said. It wasn't until I was just a few feet away that she looked up and saw me. Her face went pale and she immediately pushed the guy away, but it was too late. The damage was done. "John, what are you doing here?" she stammered, trying to put on her usual confident front, but I could see the panic in her eyes. "What am I doing here? What are you doing here, Jessica?" I shot back, my voice louder than I intended. I couldn't control the anger boiling inside me. This is what girls' night looks like now? With some random guy instead of Emily? The guy, tall, athletic, with that cocky look that just made me want to punch him, had the nerve to step forward and say, "Hey man, calm down. We were just hanging out." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Hanging out? Are you serious right now?" I turned back to Jessica, who looked like she was about to cry. "Is this why you've been acting so weird lately? Because you've been sneaking around with this asshole?" Jessica didn't answer right away. She just stood there, her mouth opening and closing like she was trying to find the right words. Finally, she said, "It's not what you think, John. We're just friends." I couldn't take it anymore. Friends? Do you really think I'm that stupid? Friends don't sneak around behind their husband's back, lie about where they are, and then end up at some guy's house at 1 a.m. The guy, sensing the tension, wisely decided to back off. "I'll let you two talk," he said, and quickly disappeared back into the house, leaving Jessica and me alone on the front lawn. I was shaking with rage, but also with a deep, gnawing hurt that was threatening to consume me. "Jessica, just tell me the truth. Are you cheating on me?" She looked down at the ground, tears welling up in her eyes. John, she started, but she couldn't finish the sentence. And that silence said everything. That was the moment I knew. She didn't need to say anything more. The woman I loved, the woman I thought I would spend the rest of my life with, had betrayed me. We stood there in silence for what felt like an eternity, the weight of the truth hanging between us. Finally, Jessica broke the silence, her voice barely more than a whisper. "John, I'm so sorry. I never meant for this to happen." I wanted to scream, to demand why, but all I could manage was, "How long, Jessica? How long has this been going on?" She hesitated, which only made the knot in my stomach tighten. "A few months," she finally admitted, her eyes still focused on the ground, unable to meet mine. "It just started as a distraction, I guess. Things have been so tense between us, and I didn't know how to fix it." "A few months?" I repeated, incredulous. I felt like the ground was falling out from under me. All those nights she came home late, all the fights that seemed to come out of nowhere. It all made sense now. "So while I was sitting at home worrying about you, you were out doing this?" Jessica looked up at me, tears streaming down her face. "I know I messed up, John, but I swear it didn't mean anything. It was stupid. I was stupid." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "It didn't mean anything? Do you even hear yourself? You've been sneaking around behind my back for months, lying to my face, and you think it doesn't mean anything?" She tried to reach for me, but I pulled back, not wanting her touch anywhere near me. "John, please, you have to believe me. It was a mistake. I love you. I just got lost, and I didn't know how to stop." I could feel the anger bubbling up again, but it was mixed with so much sadness and disappointment that I didn't know what to do with it. "Lost? You didn't know how to stop? Jessica, this isn't some little mistake. You made a choice every single time you lied, every time you went out to see him instead of talking to me." She wiped at her tears, but they kept coming. I know, and I'm sorry, John. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm begging you. Please, just give me a chance to make this right." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to think that maybe, just maybe, this was something we could work through. But the truth was, I didn't even know who I was looking at anymore. The woman in front of me wasn't the same Jessica I married. I shook my head, trying to make sense of everything. "Why didn't you just talk to me? If you were unhappy, if something was wrong, why didn't you just say something?" She sobbed harder, barely able to speak through the tears. "I don't know, John. I was scared. Scared you wouldn't understand, that you'd think I was a terrible person. And now I've ruined everything." I felt numb. The anger, the hurt. It was all there, but it was like I was detached from it. Like it was happening to someone else. "Yeah, Jessica, you did ruin everything. After that, I couldn't stand there anymore. The pain, the betrayal, it was too much." I turned away from her and started walking back to my car. I didn't even know where I was going. I just needed to get away from her, from the house, from everything that reminded me of the life I thought we had. "John, wait!" Jessica called after me, her voice desperate, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. I got in my car and drove off, leaving her standing there alone. I drove aimlessly for what felt like hours, the world outside my window a blur. My mind was racing, replaying every moment of our relationship, trying to pinpoint where things went wrong. How had I missed the signs? How had I been so blind to what was happening right in front of me? Eventually, I pulled into a random parking lot and just sat there, staring at the steering wheel. The anger had faded, leaving behind a deep, aching sadness. This was my wife. The woman I'd promised to love and cherish for the rest of my life. And now, everything felt like a lie. I tried to wrap my head around what she'd said. That it was just a distraction. That she got lost. That she didn't mean for any of this to happen. But none of it made sense. How do you accidentally cheat on someone for months? How do you get lost and end up in another man's bed? It wasn't something you just fell into. It was a choice, and she made that choice over and over again. I thought about the life we'd built together, the plans we'd made. We were supposed to start trying for a baby next year. We talked about names, about what we wanted for our future. How could she throw all of that away for some guy she barely knew? And yet, despite everything, part of me still loved her. Or maybe it was the memory of who she used to be, the woman who made me laugh, who was my best friend, who I thought I could trust with anything. I didn't know how to reconcile that person with the one who had betrayed me so deeply. I was stuck, torn between the love I still felt and the overwhelming pain of her betrayal. I didn't know what to do, where to go from here. All I knew was that nothing would ever be the same again. I must have sat in that parking lot for hours, lost in my thoughts. I kept replaying everything Jessica had said, everything I'd seen, trying to make sense of it all. But the more I thought about it, the angrier I got. The lies, the deceit. It was like a knife twisting in my gut. I couldn't just leave it like this. I needed answers. I needed to know why, even if it tore me apart. So I drove home. The house was dark when I pulled into the driveway. It felt eerie, like it wasn't really my home anymore. I walked in, and there she was, sitting on the couch in the living room, her face buried in her hands. She looked up when I walked in, her eyes red and puffy from crying. "John," she said softly, like she didn't know what else to say. I didn't respond right away. I just stood there, looking at her. This woman I'd spent almost a decade of my life with, now a stranger to me. "I want the truth, Jessica," I finally said, my voice cold. "No more lies. I deserve that much." She nodded, wiping her eyes, and started talking. It was like a dam had broken, and all the things she'd been holding back came pouring out. She told me that it started as harmless flirting at work. This guy, Mike, was new, charming, and gave her attention she hadn't felt in a while. What started as small talk in the break room turned into lunch dates, which then turned into late-night texts. And eventually, it turned into more. It felt good, John," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I know that sounds awful, but I was feeling so disconnected from you, like we were just going through the motions. And Mike made me feel alive, I guess." I felt sick to my stomach hearing her say that. "So you decided to cheat instead of talking to me? Instead of trying to fix what was wrong between us?" She shook her head, more tears streaming down her face. I know. I should have come to you. But by the time I realized how deep I was in, it was too late. I was scared, John. Scared of losing you. Scared of what you'd think of me if I told you the truth." "And you thought lying to me was better?" I shot back, my voice rising. "You thought sneaking around, betraying me was the better option?" She broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. "I'm so sorry, John. I know I messed up. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I love you. I don't want to lose you. I'll do anything to make this right." Her words hung in the air, heavy with desperation. I wanted to believe her, wanted to think that maybe, just maybe, we could find a way to move past this. But the hurt was still too raw, the betrayal too deep. I stood there, torn between the life we'd built together and the reality of what she'd done. Could I really forgive her? Could I ever trust her again? The questions swirled in my mind, and I had no answers. All I knew was that whatever came next wouldn't be easy. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling while Jessica cried softly beside me. The emotional roller coaster I was on felt endless. One moment, I was furious, and the next, I was devastated. I had no idea what to do, and the thought of making any kind of decision terrified me. So I did what any confused and broken man might do in this day and age. I turned to the internet. I grabbed my phone and started scrolling through forums and Reddit threads, searching for stories like mine, looking for anything that might give me some clarity. I wanted to know if it was possible to come back from something like this, if anyone had ever really forgiven and forgotten after a betrayal this deep. I found thread after thread filled with people who had been in my shoes, men and women who had discovered their partner's infidelity and were grappling with the same emotions I was feeling. Some had worked through it and rebuilt their relationships, but others had walked away, unable to get past the hurt and mistrust. The responses were mixed, but one thing was clear. No matter what path they chose, it was going to be a long, painful road. I spent hours reading, absorbing other people's stories, until one post really hit home. It was from a guy who had been cheated on by his wife of 15 years. He talked about how at first he was consumed by anger, ready to walk away and never look back. But after some time and distance, he realized that if he really loved her and if she was truly remorseful, then maybe they could rebuild something stronger from the wreckage. His words stuck with me, and for the first time since I found out, I started to think about what forgiveness might look like. Could I ever get to that place? Could Jessica and I work through this and come out on the other side? It wasn't just about forgiving her, it was about whether I could ever trust her again, whether I could look at her without seeing the image of her with another man. But as much as I wanted answers, I knew no one on the internet could give me the solution to my problems. This was something I had to figure out for myself. It was clear that I needed time to process everything, to let the emotions settle so I could think straight. When I finally put my phone down, I felt a small sense of relief. I wasn't alone in this. There were people out there who had been through worse and survived. And maybe, just maybe, I could too. The next morning, I woke up feeling like I'd been hit by a truck. Everything that had happened the night before came rushing back. And for a moment, I wondered if it had all been a bad dream. But then I looked over at Jessica, who was already awake, staring blankly at the ceiling. The reality of our situation crashed down on me all over again. We didn't say much as we got ready for the day. The silence between us was heavy, filled with all the things we weren't saying. I kept replaying our conversation in my head, the way she'd admitted to everything, the way she'd begged for forgiveness. I wanted to scream at her, demand to know how she could do this to us, but I didn't have the energy. I felt drained, like I was running on empty. When I finally couldn't take the silence anymore, I turned to her. "We need to talk," I said, my voice rough from lack of sleep. She nodded, looking as exhausted as I felt. "I know." We sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd shared so many meals, so many conversations about our future. Now it felt like a battlefield. I didn't know where to start, but I knew I couldn't keep avoiding the inevitable. "I've been thinking about what you said last night," I began, trying to keep my voice steady. "About how you felt disconnected, how this all started because you were unhappy." She looked down at her hands, fidgeting with her wedding ring. "I know it sounds like an excuse, but it's the truth. I was feeling lost, and instead of talking to you about it, I made the worst mistake of my life." "Why didn't you talk to me?" I asked, the hurt creeping into my voice. "We've always been able to talk about everything. Why was this different?" She sighed, tears welling up in her eyes again. "I don't know, John. I guess I was scared that if I admitted I was unhappy, you'd think it was your fault, that you'd blame yourself. And the truth is, it wasn't your fault. It was mine. I let things get out of control, and I didn't know how to stop." I felt a lump forming in my throat, but I swallowed it down. "Do you even want to fix this, Jessica? Or are you just saying what you think I want to hear?" She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a mix of fear and desperation. "I want to fix this, John. I really do. I love you, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right. But I know that's not something that's going to happen overnight." Her words hit me hard. I wanted to believe her, but there was a part of me that couldn't forget what I'd seen, what she'd done. "I don't know if I can trust you again," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I understand. And I know I have to earn that trust back, if that's even possible." We sat there in silence for a long time, both of us lost in our own thoughts. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing for sure. Things would never be the same between us. The illusion of our perfect life had been shattered, and there was no going back. The cold, hard reality was that we were both standing on the edge of a cliff, and I wasn't sure if we were going to fall or find a way to climb back up together. After that conversation, I knew I needed space. The weight of everything was too much, and I needed time to clear my head, to figure out what I really wanted. I told Jessica that I needed some time alone to think, and she agreed without protest, probably sensing how close I was to breaking. I packed a bag and decided to stay with my brother, Mark, for a few days. Mark and I have always been close, and I knew he'd understand, or at least be someone I could talk to without judgment. When I arrived at his place, he took one look at me and knew something was seriously wrong. "Hey man, what's going on?" he asked as he helped me bring my stuff inside. I hadn't planned on telling him everything right away, but as soon as we sat down with a couple of beers, it all came pouring out. I told him about the late nights, the lies, the other guy, everything. Mark listened quietly, letting me get it all out, and when I finally finished, He just shook his head. Jesus, John. I'm sorry, man. I had no idea things were that bad. Neither did I admitted. I knew something was off, but I never imagined this. Mark leaned back in his chair, taking a long sip of his beer. What are you going to do? I don't know, I said honestly. Part of me wants to try and work things out, but another part of me doesn't know if I can ever trust her again. I'm so confused, man. I don't know what the right move is. He nodded, thinking it over. I get it. And look, whatever you decide, I'm here for you. But you've got to do what's right for you. If you think there's a chance you two can work through this, then maybe it's worth a shot, but if not, you've got to be honest with yourself. His words made sense, but they didn't make the decision any easier. I knew I had to figure out what I really wanted, but the problem was, I didn't even know how I felt half the time. 1 minute I was ready to forgive her, thinking we could somehow rebuild what we had, and the next, I was filled with so much anger and betrayal that the thought of even being in the same room as her made me sick. Over the next few days, I spent a lot of time reflecting on our marriage, on the good times and the bad. I thought about who we were when we first met, how in love we were, and how much we'd both changed over the years. I thought about the life we'd built, the memories we'd shared, and whether any of that was enough to outweigh the pain she'd caused. Mark was a big help during this time, giving me the space I needed but also being there when I just needed to talk. He didn't push me one way or the other, and for that, I was grateful. He reminded me that this was my decision, and that I had to make the choice that was right for me, not anyone else. By the end of the week, I felt a little more grounded. I still didn't have all the answers, but I knew I couldn't avoid the situation forever. I had to face Jessica again. Had to decide whether we were going to try to pick up the pieces or if it was time to walk away. As I packed up my stuff and prepared to head back home, I realized that no matter what happened, this was a turning point. My life was never going to be the same, but I was starting to accept that. The question now was whether Jessica and I were going to face this together or if we were about to go our separate ways. When I got back home, the house felt different. It wasn't just the physical space. It was like the atmosphere had changed. Everything that had happened in the last few days hung over us like a dark cloud. Jessica was in the kitchen when I walked in, and she looked up at me with a mixture of hope and fear in her eyes. "Hi," she said softly, almost like she was afraid to speak any louder. "Hey," I replied, setting my bag down. The awkwardness between us was palpable, and I wasn't sure how to break it. I wanted to talk to her, but I also didn't know where to start. We stood there in silence for a moment before she spoke again. "Did you have time to think?" I nodded, taking a deep breath. "Yeah, I did. And honestly, I'm still trying to figure out how I feel about everything. But I think we need to talk, really talk, about what happens next." She nodded, biting her lip like she was trying to hold back tears. "I'm ready whenever you are." We moved to the living room and sat down on the couch, facing each other. For a moment, neither of us said anything, and the tension was unbearable. Finally, I decided to break the ice. "Jessica, I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about why this happened. And while I can understand feeling lost or disconnected, it doesn't excuse what you did. You hurt me in a way I never thought possible, and I don't know if I can just move past that." She looked devastated, but she nodded, accepting my words. "I know, John, and I'm not asking you to just forget about it. I know I broke your trust, and I'll do whatever it takes to earn it back. But I need to know if you think there's a chance for us, or if you've already made up your mind." I hesitated, struggling to find the right words. "I don't know if I can trust you again, Jessica. That's the truth. But I also don't want to throw away 8 years of marriage without trying to see if there's anything left to save." She reached out and took my hand, her grip trembling. "I'll do whatever it takes, John. Counseling, therapy, whatever you need. I'm willing to put in the work if you are." The sincerity in her voice hit me hard. I knew she was serious, but I also knew that healing from this wouldn't be easy or quick. Trust doesn't just magically reappear after being shattered. It has to be rebuilt piece by piece, and that takes time. "I think we need to take things one step at a time," I finally said. "Maybe start with counseling, see if we can even begin to repair what's broken. But I can't promise that everything will go back to the way it was. We have to be honest with each other about that." She nodded, tears spilling over again. I understand. I'm so sorry, John. I wish I could take it all back, but I know I can't. All I can do is try to be better, to be the wife you deserve." Her words tugged at my heart, but the pain was still there, lingering just beneath the surface. I squeezed her hand, trying to convey that I was willing to try, even if I didn't know where this path would lead us. "We'll take it one day at a time," I said. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I saw a glimmer of hope in her eyes. But even as we agreed to move forward, I knew that the road ahead would be long and filled with challenges. The question was whether we were strong enough to make it through together, or if this was the beginning of the end. The next few days were some of the most difficult I've ever experienced. Jessica and I had agreed to try and work things out, but every interaction was fraught with tension. We were both walking on eggshells, afraid to say or do the wrong thing. It was exhausting, and I couldn't help but wonder if this was how our lives were going to be from now on. Constantly trying, but never really succeeding in getting back to what we once had. One of the first steps we took was setting up an appointment with a marriage counselor. I wasn't sure how I felt about it at first. Part of me was skeptical. Could talking to a stranger really help us fix what was broken? But I knew we had to try something, and Jessica seemed genuinely committed to the process. Our first session was awkward, to say the least. The counselor, Dr. Harris, asked us to talk about what had brought us there, and I could barely get the words out without choking on my anger and pain. Jessica, on the other hand, was emotional but composed. She admitted to everything, her affair, her lies, the hurt she knew she had caused. It was painful to listen to, but I could tell she was trying to be honest, to own up to what she had done. Dr. Harris listened patiently, nodding along as we each took our turns speaking. Then he started asking the tough questions. Why Jessica felt the need to seek comfort outside of our marriage. Why I hadn't noticed the signs earlier. What we both wanted moving forward. It was brutal, having to lay everything out there like that. But it was also strangely cathartic. For the first time, we were really talking about the issues that had been simmering beneath the surface for so long. When the session ended, Dr. Harris gave us some homework. He asked us to write down what we valued most in our relationship and what we wanted to work on moving forward. It seemed simple enough, but as I sat down that night to actually do it, I found myself struggling. What did I value? Trust, obviously, but that had been shattered. Honesty, communication, love, they all seemed like things that should be a given. Yet here we were, having to rebuild from scratch. Jessica and I shared our lists the next day. Hers was focused on rebuilding trust, on proving to me that she was committed to making things right. Mine was more about needing time, needing space to heal, and not rushing the process. It was clear we were on the same page in some areas, but in others, we still had a long way to go. Despite the difficulties, there were small moments of progress. We started spending more time together, even if it was just sitting in the same room reading or watching TV. It wasn't much, but it was something. The counselor had advised us to reconnect in small ways, to rebuild the foundation of our relationship one brick at a time. It was hard, but I could see Jessica trying, and that made me want to try too. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were still moments where the anger would flare up inside me, where I'd look at her and all I could see was betrayal. I'd have to remind myself that healing takes time, that this wasn't going to be fixed overnight. And every time those feelings bubbled to the surface, we'd talk about them, sometimes with the counselor, sometimes just the two of us. It was difficult, but I could tell that each conversation brought us a tiny step closer to understanding. The hardest part, though, was dealing with the trust issues. I found myself questioning everything. Every time she left the house, every time she was on her phone. I hated feeling like this, like I was constantly on edge, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Jessica noticed, of course, and she did her best to reassure me. She started being more open about where she was going, who she was with, even showing me her messages if I asked. It helped, but it didn't erase the doubts completely. I realized then that rebuilding trust was going to be the biggest hurdle. It wasn't something that could just be restored with words or even actions. It was going to take time, and a lot of it. And I had to decide if I was willing to give that time, if I was willing to be patient and let the healing process run its course. For now, I was willing to try. Jessica seemed sincere in her efforts, and I could see how much she regretted what she had done. But I knew that we still had a long road ahead of us, and there was no guarantee that we'd make it to the other side together. All I could do was take it one day at a time and hope that, eventually, the love we once had would be strong enough to carry us through. As the weeks went by, Jessica and I settled into a new, uneasy routine. We continued seeing Dr. Harris regularly, and while the sessions were helpful, they were also emotionally draining. Each time we had to dig deeper into our feelings, unearthing the pain and mistrust that had built up between us. Some days, I left the sessions feeling a glimmer of hope. Other days, I wondered if we were just prolonging the inevitable. The strain of trying to rebuild our marriage was starting to take its toll on both of us. Jessica was constantly on edge, trying to anticipate my moods and reassure me that she was committed to making things right. She was always careful about where she went, who she talked to, and she made sure to keep me in the loop about everything. But despite her best efforts, I could tell that the pressure was getting to her. I wasn't doing much better. I found myself obsessing over the smallest things, wondering if she was really where she said she was, questioning whether she was still in contact with Mike. Every time her phone buzzed, my heart would skip a beat. It was exhausting, and I hated the person I was becoming. I didn't want to be the paranoid husband, constantly doubting and second-guessing everything, but I couldn't seem to stop myself. One night, after a particularly difficult counseling session, I lost it. We had been talking about boundaries, about how to rebuild trust in practical ways, and I realized how overwhelming it all felt. When we got home, Jessica tried to talk to me about something trivial, but I snapped. "Why are you even talking to me right now?" I blurted out, my voice harsh. "I can't trust anything you say anymore." Jessica's face fell, and I immediately regretted my words, but the anger inside me wouldn't let go. "You expect me to just pretend everything's fine, that we can just go back to normal after everything you've done?" "I don't expect that," she said quietly, tears welling up in her eyes. "I'm just trying to show you that I'm here, that I'm committed to us." "Committed?" I scoffed, the bitterness in my voice cutting through the room. "You were committed to someone else for months, Jessica. You don't just get to erase that." She didn't say anything, just stood there, tears spilling down her cheeks. The sight of her crying used to break my heart, but now it just made me feel empty. I turned away from her, not wanting to look at her anymore, and went to the bedroom, slamming the door behind me. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I felt like I was drowning. The anger, the sadness, the frustration, it was all consuming me, and I didn't know how to break free. I wanted to believe that we could get through this, that all the work we were putting in would eventually pay off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were fighting a losing battle. The next morning, I woke up feeling like I hadn't slept at all. Jessica had already left for work, and the house felt eerily quiet without her. I found a note she'd left on the kitchen counter telling me that she loved me and that she was sorry for everything. I crumpled it up and threw it in the trash, but the guilt of my actions from the night before weighed heavily on me. I knew I needed to apologize, to tell her that I didn't mean what I said, but I also knew that my outburst was a sign of something deeper. The resentment I was holding on to was starting to eat away at me, and if I didn't find a way to deal with it, it was going to destroy any chance we had of moving forward. That day at work, I could barely focus. My mind kept drifting back to Jessica, to the note, to the look on her face when I lashed out at her. I knew I couldn't keep going like this, but I didn't know how to stop. The anger and hurt were always just beneath the surface, ready to erupt at any moment. When I got home that evening, Jessica was sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the TV. She looked up when I walked in, and I could see the exhaustion in her eyes, an exhaustion that mirrored my own. "I'm sorry," I said, breaking the silence between us, "for last night. I shouldn't have said those things." She nodded, but didn't say anything. And that hurt more than anything. We were both so worn out, so drained from everything that had happened, that it felt like we were just going through the motions. "I don't know how to do this, Jessica," I admitted, sitting down beside her. "I don't know how to get past this." She finally looked at me, her eyes filled with sadness. "Neither do I, John. But I want to try. I want to believe that we can find a way to make this work, even if it's hard." We sat there in silence for a long time, both of us lost in our own thoughts. I knew that if we were going to have any chance of rebuilding our marriage, we had to start letting go of the past. But letting go was easier said than done, especially when the pain was still so fresh. "I think we need to give ourselves some grace," Jessica said quietly, breaking the silence. "We're both hurting, and we're both trying to figure this out. But maybe we need to take a step back and focus on healing ourselves before we can heal us." Her words made sense, but they also scared me. Taking a step back sounded dangerously close to giving up, and I wasn't sure if we could survive another blow like that. But I also knew that pushing forward without addressing the deep wounds we both had wouldn't lead to anything good. "Maybe you're right," I finally said, my voice heavy with resignation. "Maybe we need to take a break from trying to fix everything and just focus on getting ourselves right." It was a difficult decision, but it felt like the only option we had left. We agreed to give each other space, to stop forcing conversations, to stop trying to rush the healing process, and to just let things be for a while. It wasn't a separation, but it was a pause, a chance to breathe and regroup. I didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in a long while I felt a tiny bit of relief. The road ahead was still uncertain, but at least now we weren't pretending that everything was okay. We were finally being honest with ourselves, and maybe that was the first step towards something better, whatever that might be. Taking a step back wasn't easy. The first few days were awkward as we navigated this new phase of our relationship. We stopped trying to force deep conversations and instead focused on giving each other space. It was strange, almost like we were living as roommates rather than a married couple. But oddly enough, it brought a certain calm to the house that hadn't been there since everything fell apart. During this time, I threw myself into work and started reconnecting with old hobbies I'd neglected. I began going to the gym again, something I hadn't done in years. It was a way to burn off the anger and frustration that still lingered, and it gave me a sense of control over something in my life. I also started meeting up with friends more often, something I hadn't realized I'd missed so much. It was good to be around people who didn't know all the details of what I was going through, who just treated me like the same old John. Jessica, too, found ways to cope. She started attending individual therapy sessions on top of our marriage counseling, and I could tell it was helping her. She was quieter, more reflective, and when we did talk, there was a sincerity in her that I hadn't seen in a long time. She wasn't trying to justify or excuse what she'd done anymore. She was just trying to understand herself, and that made a difference. After a couple of weeks of this new routine, something began to shift. I started noticing the little things Jessica was doing, leaving notes for me in my lunch, making my favorite dinner, asking about my day with genuine interest. They were small gestures, but they felt meaningful. I wasn't ready to fully forgive her, but I could see that she was trying, and that mattered. One evening, about a month after we'd decided to take a step back, Jessica approached me while I was sitting on the porch, nursing a beer and watching the sunset. She stood there for a moment as if unsure whether to join me, and then finally sat down in the chair beside me. "Can we talk?" she asked softly. I nodded, not sure what she was going to say, but ready to hear her out. "I've been thinking a lot," she began, "about everything that's happened, about us, and I just wanted to say thank you." I raised an eyebrow. "Thank you? For what?" "For giving me a chance to prove that I'm serious about fixing this," she said, her voice steady. "I know it hasn't been easy, and I know I've put you through hell, but I want you to know that I'm here. I'm not going anywhere, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes, for as long as it takes." Her words took me by surprise. There was a conviction in her tone that I hadn't heard before, and for the first time, I started to believe that maybe, just maybe, she was as committed to healing as I was. "I appreciate that, Jessica," I said, choosing my words carefully. "And I've noticed that you're really trying. I won't lie, it's still hard for me to trust, but I can see you're doing everything you can to earn it back." She nodded, tears welling up in her eyes but not spilling over. "I know I can't change the past, but I want to build a future with you. A future that's better than what we had before. And if you're willing, I'd like to start that future together." It was a big ask, and she knew it, but there was something about the way she said it that made me think maybe it wasn't impossible. Maybe after everything we could find our way back to each other. "I think we can try," I said after a long pause, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders. "But we have to be honest with each other. No more hiding, no more pretending. If we're going to do this, it has to be real." Jessica smiled, and for the first time in months, it felt like the tension between us eased. "I promise, John, no more lies. Just us, working through this, one day at a time." We sat there in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sky turn from orange to pink to deep blue. It wasn't a magic fix, and I knew we still had a long way to go. But in that moment, it felt like we were finally moving in the right direction. Like there was a possibility of healing, even if it was just a small one. That night, for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the need to sleep on the edge of the bed, as far from her as possible. I still wasn't ready to hold her close, but I didn't flinch when she reached out to touch my hand before drifting off to sleep. It was a small step, but it felt like the start of something new. Something we could build on if we both kept trying. Maybe it wasn't the end after all. The next few weeks were a test of patience and commitment for both of us. Jessica and I continued our individual therapy sessions, along with our joint marriage counseling. We were learning how to communicate again, how to express our feelings without letting anger and hurt dominate the conversation. It wasn't easy, and there were still moments when the past would creep in and threaten to derail our progress, but we were slowly finding our footing. One of the most significant breakthroughs came during a counseling session. Dr. Harris asked us to each describe what we felt had been missing in our marriage before the affair. It was a difficult question, one that forced us to confront some uncomfortable truths about our relationship. "I think I lost sight of who I was," Jessica said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "I got so caught up in trying to be everything to everyone at work, at home, that I forgot who I was as a person, as your wife. And instead of talking to you about it, I ran away from it, trying to find validation elsewhere. It was wrong, and I know that now. But that's where I was." Hearing her say that was like a punch to the gut, but it also made a twisted kind of sense. We'd been together for so long that we'd stopped putting in the effort to really connect with each other. Life had gotten in the way, and we'd both let it happen. I think I was so focused on providing, on making sure everything was perfect, that I didn't notice you were slipping away, I admitted. I thought if I just kept working hard, kept doing what I thought was expected of me, that everything would be fine. But I was wrong. I should have been paying more attention to you, to us. Dr. Harris nodded, encouraging us to keep going. It's important to acknowledge these feelings, to understand where the disconnect happened. But what's even more important is how you both choose to move forward. What do you need from each other to rebuild that connection? That was the million-dollar question, and one that took us several more sessions to fully explore. We talked about everything: how to rebuild trust, how to keep the lines of communication open, how to make time for each other in a way that felt meaningful. It was like we were rediscovering our relationship from the ground up. One of the things that came out of those conversations was the need to create new memories together. So we started doing things we hadn't done in years, going out on dates, trying new activities, even something as simple as cooking a meal together without any distractions. It wasn't about pretending the past hadn't happened. It was about focusing on the present and the future, about finding joy in each other's company again. One weekend, we decided to go away for a short trip, just the two of us. It was something we used to do often when we were first married, but life had gotten in the way, and we hadn't taken time for ourselves in years. We rented a cabin a few hours away, nestled in the woods, and spent the weekend hiking, talking, and just being together without any pressure or distractions. That trip was a turning point for us. It wasn't like everything magically fixed itself, but it reminded us of why we fell in love in the first place. We laughed together. We reminisced about the early days of our relationship, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I saw glimpses of the woman I'd married, the one who was my best friend, my partner in everything. When we got back home, we were both determined to keep that momentum going. We started implementing some of the tools we'd learned in therapy: daily check-ins where we could talk about how we were feeling, setting aside time each week to do something together, even if it was just watching a movie or going for a walk. But we also knew that this was just the beginning. Rebuilding our marriage wasn't something that was going to happen overnight or even in a few months. It was going to be a continuous effort, something we'd have to work on every single day. There were still tough moments. Sometimes, a memory or a comment would bring back the pain, and we'd have to stop and talk through it. But each time, it got a little bit easier. The trust was slowly starting to return, and with it, the hope that maybe, just maybe, we could come out of this stronger than before. By the time we hit the 6-month mark after the affair, things were starting to feel more normal. It wasn't the same as it had been before. We were both different people now, but it was a new kind of normal, one that we were building together, brick by brick. And while I knew we still had a long way to go, I was beginning to believe that we were going to make it. We weren't just surviving anymore, we were starting to live again. As the months continued to pass, life began to settle into a rhythm that felt almost comfortable. The pain of Jessica's betrayal didn't disappear overnight. If anything, it lingered like a scar, always there, but less raw as time went on. But what surprised me was how we both found ways to grow from it, both as individuals and as a couple. Jessica and I had come a long way since the night I discovered her affair. Trust was still something we were rebuilding, but it was no longer the all-consuming issue it once was. We had learned to communicate better, to be open and honest about our feelings without letting anger or fear drive the conversation. It wasn't perfect, and we still had our moments, but we were in a much better place than we had been. One evening, as we were sitting together on the porch, enjoying the sunset like we used to, Jessica turned to me and said something that caught me off guard. "You know, I've been thinking a lot about what happened," she began, her voice calm. "And I realize now that as horrible as it was, it forced us to confront things we'd been ignoring for a long time. I hate that it took something so painful to get us here, but I'm glad we're finally really talking to each other, really trying." I looked at her, seeing the sincerity in her eyes, and I knew she was right. As much as I wished the affair had never happened, it had forced us to face the cracks in our relationship that we'd both been ignoring. It had made us stronger in some ways, more aware of the importance of nurturing our marriage. "I think you're right," I admitted. "We've come a long way, and I'm proud of that. But I also know that this is something we'll have to keep working on, every day, and I'm okay with that." She smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes, something I hadn't seen in a long time. "Me too. I'm committed to this, John, to us. I'm not going to take our marriage for granted ever again." Her words reassured me, but they also reminded me of the importance of vigilance in a relationship. We'd both made mistakes, hers more egregious than mine, but we were learning from them. We were rebuilding not just what we had, but something new, something stronger. In the following weeks, we continued to work on our relationship. We made a habit of going on date nights again, something we'd let slip over the years. We started planning more weekend getaways, small trips that allowed us to reconnect without the distractions of daily life. And perhaps most importantly, we kept up with our counseling sessions, even when things seemed to be going well. It was a reminder that this journey was ongoing, that there was always room to grow. I won't pretend that everything was perfect. There were still times when a memory or a stray thought would bring back a wave of hurt, but those moments were becoming less frequent. And when they did happen, I found that I could talk to Jessica about them without it turning into a fight. She was patient, understanding, and most importantly, she never dismissed my feelings, no matter how uncomfortable the conversation might be. One of the biggest changes I noticed in myself was a newfound sense of self-worth. The affair had shattered my confidence, made me question everything about myself and our relationship. But as we worked through the pain, I started to realize that I was stronger than I'd given myself credit for. I'd faced one of the hardest challenges a marriage can go through, and I was coming out the other side, not unscathed, but certainly more resilient. And Jessica? Well, she had changed too. She was more attentive, more aware of the little things that make a relationship work. She made it clear every day that she was committed to making amends, not just with words, but with actions. She was becoming the partner I needed, the one I deserved, and I could see that she was doing it because she wanted to, not because she felt obligated. As we approached the one-year mark since the affair, I found myself reflecting on how far we'd come. A year ago, I couldn't have imagined that we'd still be together, let alone that we'd be in a place where I could say with confidence that I was happy. Not happy in the naive, blissfully ignorant way I once was, but a deeper, more grounded happiness that came from knowing we'd fought for this, and we were stronger because of it. I won't say that I've completely forgiven Jessica. Forgiveness, like trust, is something that takes time, and I'm still on that journey. But I can say that I've accepted what happened, and I've chosen to move forward with her. Not because I'm afraid of being alone, but because I believe in the future we're building together. So, for anyone reading this who's going through something similar, I want to say this. It's possible to come out the other side. It's not easy and it's not quick. But if both of you are willing to put in the work, there's a chance to not just survive, but to thrive. It's a long, painful road, but it's one that can lead to something better, something stronger. And for us, the journey continues. We're still learning, still growing, still figuring out what our new normal looks like, but we're doing it together, and that's something worth fighting for.